Well, good morning. I am Sarah Gessinger, president of the Sterling Society. And first of all, I want to welcome you and thank you for attending our third Zoom meeting of Coffee and Conversation. And to say the least, to our most unusual year of 2021. I mean, will we ever have this again? We all pray not. We thank our Coffee and Conversation sponsor, Diane Wheatley Gelati. Diane has been a longstanding member of the Dunedin Fine Arts Center. She served as president of the board of directors. She has been also instrumental in drafting our Sterling Society bylaws back in 2005. That's how long we've been around. And she provided leadership as the chair of the Creative Visions capital campaign that DFAC had. And that was a campaign to build the Flack East Wing. So the entire East Wing was donated by the Flack family and so that wing was built at the Art Center due to that, and Diane led that campaign. And so Diane, we thank you so much for this. Everything that she has done, her sponsorship will pay for all of this Zoom and everything. It's covering everything. We appreciate it so much. So be on the lookout for information concerning our signature event, which is our Founders Luncheon and Patron of the Arts Award. It'll be February the 12th, 2021. And we're trying to tailor our event to accommodate everyone. It's hasn't been easy, but we've done a lot of soul searching about this. So we are going to provide outside or inside dining. And even though it'll be cold in February, we're doing heaters outside on a patio at the venue. And you can also stay at home. We know that there are people that will not have had maybe their shot and they still want to stay at home. And if they do, we're going to do it by Zoom. By being ready with Zoom, we're hoping that is going to be our fallback. We don't know what it's going to be like in February. We have no, crystal ball that tells us. So we can just go totally to Zoom if we have to. All sponsors of this will receive a luncheon, no matter what. It'll be delivered to you wherever you are. So that's one thing that we're trying to accomplish. Diane Van Duzen has done an outstanding job. Oh my gosh, coordinating our Coffee and Conversation. And I am now going to turn the program over to her. And thank you so much, Diane.
You're welcome. And thank you, Sarah. I'm going to go over just a little bit of logistics with those that are signed on before I introduce the artists. So just in case you weren't automatically muted on joining the meeting, I'll ask you to do that. There's a button either at the bottom left of your screen in order to mute yourself, or it might show up in your actual image as a little microphone. So after we get going in the program and throughout, McArthur, we ask the audience to use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to type your questions. And if there's any concerns that arise during the presentation, for me, you can type also in that chat box and I'll answer in the chat. And then after the presentation, we'll have time for question and answers. So I'd be looking at the chat box to see who's asked questions and we'll pose them. So getting on to our artist. Today's artist is McArthur Freeman II, whose works are featured in the Vespertine exhibit at DFAC through December 24. McArthur Freeman is a visual artist and designer whose work explores hybridity and the construction of identity. His works have ranged from surreal narrative paintings and drawings to digitally constructed sculpture objects and animated 3D scenes. His most recent works combine three interrelated emerging technologies: digital sculpting, 3D scanning, and 3D printing. This should be fascinating for those of us who are not very technologically astute. Freeman's work has been published in NKA Journal of Contemporary African Art and has been exhibited nationally in both group and solo shows. He has presented talks at an organization called SIGGRAPH, Special Interest Group on Computer Graphics and Interactive Techniques in Asia, and more recently at the National Council on Education for Ceramic Arts. Freeman is the recipient of the prestigious McKnight Junior Faculty Fellowship. Freeman earned his BFA degree in drawing and painting from the University of Florida. He received his MFA from Cornell University with a concentration in painting. He also holds a Master's of Art in Design from North Carolina State University in Animation and New Media. Freeman is currently an Associate Professor of Video, Animation, and Digital Arts at the University of South Florida, where he continues to use digital tools to address traditional processes as he explores hybrid ways of making and thinking about art. So I am going to mute myself now, and McArthur will go through his presentation. And thank you all for joining.
Hello, and thank you. And good afternoon to everyone. Of course, my name is McArthur Freeman. And first, I just want to thank Dunedin Fine Arts Center and the Sterling Society for having me here, and all of you for coming, or at least tuning in this afternoon. This session is sculpting with digital tools from tablets to VR. And I want to talk a bit about my journey for the last 10 years or so as an artist. And it has been a journey for me as my work has progressed in an unexpected way. As well, the path has been a great learning experience for me. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with you today. Now more than ever, I would say digital technology is an integral part of our lives. And if we couldn't say that at least as easily before this year, it's obvious now more than ever as we find new ways to connect, work, and adapt. At the same time, as our digital tools have begun to sort of mature and continue to evolve, it's an exciting time to be an artist because new tools and new technology don't just allow us to make new things, although that's important. They also facilitate new ways of thinking, and they allow us to think differently. They make us question strategies that we have always used and prompt us to embrace the way we've done things, or find the relevance for transforming them and doing them differently. I see myself as someone who really tries to bridge traditional and digital ways of working. And that means that I see the potential of new media as an extension of traditional creative practices rather than something distinctly in its own box. If I were to say that in another way, I didn't start here. I started as a painter. And before that, my foundation was in drawing, and everything else sort of stems from that. So I still see it as the same thing, but with new tools and new strategies along the way. I grew up reading comic books and telling stories, which sparked my interest in creating characters, working with the figure, world building, and inventing narratives, which is definitely a large part of my work. As mentioned before, as an undergrad, I studied drawing and painting at the University of Florida. At the same time I was there, I actually studied graphic design as well, sort of coming in, and then I took another year before I left in graphic design. And that's where I started working with my first computer. Even throughout college, I had a word processor. That dates me a little bit, but I also got my MFA at Cornell was in painting, but at that time I was actually using digital studies for those paintings. And then at North Carolina State University for animation and new media, of course, it was directly this sort of digital process that was involved. Currently, I'm an associate professor at the University of South Florida, where I teach animation and digital modeling. And this is a shot from my digital sculpting class where students are working on characters that can later be animated. And we focus on making objects and characters move to tell stories, as well as crafting the world that exists for them. So when I say 3D modeling, I'm referring to the creation of 3D objects in the computer, and those 3D models can be used for games, for products, for illustrations, for sculptures, architecture, fine art. They can be arranged, lit, and photographed in the virtual environment, just as if they were objects in the real world. And this image is actually from one of my models that I used for a class demo where I focused on lighting. But underneath it, you can see the construction. This wireframe of points, edges, and faces are manipulated to arrive at a final shape, one mouse click at a time. And in some cases, it can be a painstaking and sort of with many technical hurdles. This is one approach to modeling on the computer, but there are several others, which I'll talk about soon. So when I went to college, I studied painting and drawing, like I said. So I started out, this is actually a painting that I did in 2004. You can see me working on the left on an oil painting, and it's named Soapbox. And 9 years later, that's me on the right preparing a 3D printer that just came off a 3D print that just came off the printer. In that time, my creative process or practice has changed dramatically. During that time, around 2004, I was creating images that combine aspects of fairy tales, children's book illustrations, and myths, which are synthesized with historical narratives and aspects of popular culture to explore different ideas about the construction of race, identity, and socialization. The title of this painting was Give Me Some Sugar. And in this painting, I was interested in the consumption of ideas about Blackness, as well as being pacified while living with a host of systemic issues. And this was one of many paintings, but I've included it here because I use this painting as my first exploration of creating 3D characters and environments based on the worlds depicted in my paintings. These are two of the characters from that painting, Bank and Nasty Jemima. As I designed characters for my works, I became more interested in increasing their sense of volume and illusion in space. Of course, I was doing that in painting, but now being able to do that in a virtual space. It's almost weird to say virtual space because that means something a little bit different now, but in the computer. But I was also interested in the potential for creating physical characters from the works as toys, which I call decolonization dolls. And that led me back to school at North Carolina State University, where I studied animation and new media. Part of my intent was to create animated scenes and digitally fabricate the figures from the work. My first attempts at this involved creating digital environments based on my recent paintings. It was closer to my idea of world building, and the models became more like objects that I would arrange, light, photograph, or animate, a sort of a digital play space. 3 years later from that initial photograph of me painting in the studio, I created my first 3D print in 2007. It was a partial model of Nasty Jemima, which was one of the characters from my paintings. Those characters use polygon modeling, similar to what I showed in that earlier slide, but I later began to use digital sculpting software that has much more of a direct and intuitive way of working. For those, I didn't use a mouse. Instead, I used a digital tablet, and my pressure on the tablet affects the intensity of change to an area. So if I push really hard on it, it affects it more. And if I touch really soft, I can subtly modify forms. Here instead, and I'll play this really quickly, here instead, you can see me sculpting. I'm working on a Cintiq, which is a screen that works with a stylus rather than a tablet. And I didn't have a sculpture background when I began working on these, but working in this way by working on a 2D surface to create 3D forms is somewhere between drawing and sculpting, which made it a lot more approachable for me.
Wow.
I don't sculpt that fast. So I was already really excited about being able to model digital environments, but digital sculpting hit home for me as an approach. It was a blend between drawing and sculpting that allowed me to use a sense of touch and form making that came from my art background and interest in the figure. Starting from something as simple as a sphere, I was able to push, pull, carve, and mold forms. And it's an ideal way for working with organic forms and working with a high number of polygons, basically like how detailed the model will be. I had an upcoming show in which I wanted to use this approach to create several digital sculptures, and that was around 2010. In preparation for that show, this was the first sculpture in a group of works called Polyfaces. Polyfaces included a series of digitally sculpted portraits that were 3D printed in gypsum, which is the same primary material used in plaster. So, it's a little bit background noise. But I kept thinking of them as contemporary versions of classical plaster and marble sculptures. On the left is the 3D printed physical sculpture, and on the right, a screenshot of the digital version. In some ways, these were like academic studies. In other ways, I like the fact that the white surfaces invited viewers to slow down and focus on the forms, but also identify features that indicated ethnicity other than color. There were 8 sculptures in this group of works. So there's a bit of a jump here. After making those 3D printed works, I started back on my path of creating characters for digitally rendered scenes. And I was interested in the idea of modifying or distorting one's body to politically and socially adapt. So I started working on figures that had modified bodies, first with costumes that included puppetry and unusual contraptions and prosthetic appendages. And later those appendages became mutated parts, and eventually those mutations began to sort of redefine and redefine the bodies themselves. It became their sort of own forms in the way that I was working. So during that time, I created these daily experimental drawings of these organic mutated forms, which I then further explored three-dimensionally through digital sculpting. So on the left, so like on this image on the left, you can see the line drawings that I created. These are digital drawings in Photoshop, and but then on the right, you can also see some of my first sculpted explorations of these forms. So this is sort of back and forth between drawing and then exploring those more as 3D forms. Over time, I created hundreds of these drawings. Generating forms and culling them down to a select few is a common way that I like to work. And I often choose 10 or less out of 100 to develop further. So I refer to these drawings as speculative drawings. And these are a few that have been captured from my sketchbooks. And in fact, I can probably point out at least 2 of them that are sculptures that I've created since then. Here you can see a similar same process, but this time I'm working digitally. So these are digital drawings where I've placed them all in one file to make notes and pick one to develop further. So that idea of sort of generating and culling, creating several of them, and then saying, okay, well, this one works and this one works, kind of narrowing it down to a select few. In the later stages, I work back and forth between drawing and sculpting to resolve the forms. Now, it's a little bit difficult to see that in this group of images, but so I'm going to kind of walk through these. So for instance, I would have a single image from one view, and then I would go into the digital sculpting app and sculpt it in the round, because I only have sort of one view. That allows me to kind of resolve those forms, but then I would draw over them. I would take an image of it and draw over them so that I could kind of develop it further, just because the drawing is very much more intuitive, but it's a way for me to think about the forms in a way that's easier to sort of design them. When creating the drawings, like I said, I would only have one view without a clear sense of the back, top, or side view. So I would sculpt and then draw them and make notes on top of them. So here are some examples of those notes, but you can see the rough sculpt. So I had a simple drawing, and actually this drawing is actually in the next frame here. But then I would take those drawings as an image and then work over them, make adjustments similar to this. So now you can see where I've kind of gone in and reworked those just to create the image. Now this is designing it. It's not necessarily the actual sculpting of it. It's really me thinking about the layout of forms over the surfaces. And this shows a similar process, same idea, the original sketch, which is on the left, and then the variations of that form as I turn it around in space. Now I use those works to create physical versions of the digital sculptures. And these are some of my first raw 3D prints from that group. I created them on a PolyJet 3D printer. And one of the unique things about this printer, as with all 3D printers, you have to have something that supports these forms. You can't just print things in midair. And it uses wax as a support material. So basically as it's printing, it's basically a big sort of block of wax. And then the harder structures are built within it. Now, most of that wax is melted away, wax is melted away in this image. But one of the things that happens is the inside is actually still wax, so it gives it this nice sort of translucent feel. So there's a hardened, there's a cured plastic that's on the outside or resin, but on the inside it's transparent. But on the inside it has this wax, so it creates a little bit of a glow with these works. Now I was using, actually I'll go back to this for a second. I was using a service bureau. I used a place that specifically did 3D printing to create these prints because I wanted to work in a way that didn't create little lines across the surface. If you've ever seen other 3D prints, oftentimes the ones that are most familiar to us, they kind of put like a string of spaghetti or something, or it's like a a hot glue gun to sort of build up the surfaces. But those create a lot of ridges. So, but this approach, this type of 3D printing made a very smooth surface in contrast. So the final objects are then cast from 3D prints in resin or bronze. And this is one titled Pineapple. It's in bronze with a steel base, and it's about 13 inches tall, and it is almost solid bronze. This one is Balloon Bump, and it is cast in resin. With most of these, orifices, sacs, and appendages are features of the work, but their forms are not specific to any actual forms in real life. I feel the works are most successful when they oscillate between being beautiful, grotesque, sensual, and humorous, somewhere in that space. And this one is called Three Heads. So I'll show a few more of these. This is Meaty Middle, Venus Curtains. While working on these, oftentimes there are associations of things that I'm making while I'm working on them, and they become parts of the title. Some of my later works, they really just became numbered rather than specific names like this. Column and Thin Line. There are about 30 sculptures in this group, which are really anatomically inspired abstractions that explore exoticization of Black bodies or monsterization of Black bodies as a jumping off point for making these works. The works may exist in digital form for months before I'm actually able to produce the physical sculptures, before I actually 3D print them all and cast them, or if it's going to be in bronze or something like that. But like these, I'm able to virtually light and render 2D images of the work. So in the computer, actually just arrange it, light it, and photograph it. And several of those have become prints like these two images. One of the advantages of working that way is that, or working digitally, is that many of the things that you create can be expressed in multiple formats and variations. Unlike those transparent prints in the first group of works, my current prints look a lot more like this. Eventually I bought my own 3D printer. It's called a Form 2 printer. It's a SLA printer, which basically means it has sort of a vat of resin, and a laser sort of goes around and passes and cures each layer. So instead of sending them off, having my own machine was a lot more flexible. There's a little bit of cleanup from the supports. So you can see those little supports that, like I said, these can't be printed in midair. But they come off pretty easily. So when these are printed, you can see I was talking about a vat of resin. They're printed upside down, like on the left, and you can see the light sensitive resin in the tank that is used for printing. And on the right is the print after I've washed it in alcohol and taken it out, the same print. The surface quality and detail is comparable, if not better than what I was initially getting. So this is, you can see from a close up here, most of the works that I have are much larger than this, but this is a test, but you can still see the amount of form that's able to be captured in the print. After I have the original resin, the original resin versions, I can use them for resin casts. So on the right, I'm experimenting with resin casts with multiple, like different colors, but also ones that are transparency, and how I think even some of them are more, they have like there's one that's clear there, but because it has bubbles in it, it's less transparent. But I've actually found ways to sort of take that out so that it's completely clear, almost like glass. Kind of like this one. So I found that I have to pour the resin in to cast them. And I found that I have to pour them really quickly before the resin hardens, or it will literally cure during mid pour. So while I was pouring this, like out of the cup, it cured while pouring it into the mold, which was sort of an amazing thing to me. I also cast works in bronze. So for those, there's an intermediate wax stage, which allows me to go back and make changes. On the right is the original 3D print, and on the left is a wax model that I refined before casting. So it has many more steps in terms of bronze casting. So working this way, it not only got me to work with new materials, this sort of casting, but also working in bronze and working in physical sculpture, because my background was really two-dimensional and digital. So so for working with physical materials that's been a large learning process, but also figuring out how to work between sort of this digital space and creating them was new. But there's a foundry that I work with in Sarasota to help cast my works. And on the right, you can see the raw bronze of one of the pieces I showed before, Pineapple. And while one of the foundry members is adding the final patina to the work. Now, it was great to have them work like that, but I also participated in a bronze casting workshop at the Anderson Ranch in Colorado, led by an artist named Norwood Viviano. And this is me on the right, because I wanted to learn more about the process and be able to cast these works myself. Just being able to have that knowledge would allow me to think of new ways that I could work with it, but also to be more informed if I'm working with a foundry. In this case, I mentioned the plastic sort of extruding 3D printers. They're called FDM printers, which are kind of like the hot glue guns, and they create a really rough texture like this. I was using a MakerBot, but I used it to create, in this case, instead of going through a wax version to the final, I was able to print this plastic version out and then melt it directly out of the mold for the bronze. So the bronze is poured in, it's so hot that it basically just burns everything out to create a final version. And this is, so on the left, you can see the final version from there, that test, as well as one of the other heads that you saw earlier. And here you can see what the raw bronze looks like before applying any type of surface patina. So if you can kind of contrast the two here. Since then, I've been working to cast my own works through mold making and ceramic shell casting. And this wax cast was used for an iron pour in Sloss furnaces in Birmingham, Alabama. So rather than bronze, I was working with iron, but the process is very similar to how all my works are made now, where there are sprues, which is this sort of system of or wax pattern. They're almost like arteries leading up to the sculpture that allow air to be removed from the sculpture, or to leave from the sculpture when the bronze is poured in. And it's dipped multiple times into this ceramic shell, which is used to make this final more. So the final pieces are actually cast in this dipped coating of ceramic shell in the piece. So you can see I'm the dipped part and then the original wax, or the earlier wax. And then afterward, I just have to chip all of that away. So you can see I've used chisels to get to those undercut areas. Now, again, these works and the ones that I've shown so far are fairly small. So out of an interest in being able to create larger works, I started working with CNC routing as a process for fabricating them. For those who are not familiar with a CNC router, if you think of a 3D printer that builds up forms and layers additively, a CNC router uses a block of material or a flat sheet and then carves away from it using different bits. So for the first project I did, just to kind of give you a sense of like how this works, I did like a tic-tac-toe board. And CNC routers are particularly well suited for creating cuts in sheet material like this to create cutouts or recessed pockets. And you can see the bit that's right above the image there. And I just used a drawing software to create the initial design, and it just carves them out, right? Again, another example of that, something to create a chair, just carves directly down. But the other thing that I'm able to do is you can still carve three-dimensional shapes like this one. It's actually, this is actually a carving of my son in wood that I took from a 3D scan that I made of him. So this image, the only thing that is real in this image is the space in terms of the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. But the sculptures, the person, and the pedestals that they're on are all sort of three-dimensional. So I use this to create a proposal for a residency because I wanted to be able to make larger works at this scale. And at the time it was for ceramics, which was fairly new to me, or at least working with ceramics was fairly new to me. And there's probably no way I could actually make the larger scale pieces that I'm looking at in this work, but I wanted to be able to make things larger. And the CNC router gave me a path to be able to move in that direction. So instead, I worked with this digital fabrication residency to develop a workflow for CNC routing. And here you can see the forms separated into individual slices that can be reassembled in this sort of sheet material. So it is carving them dimensionally, but it's doing it in a very sort of shallow space, like these sheets of foam, narrow sheets of foam. And these are tests. There's a roughing pass, the general shape where you can see like a big bit is going over them, and then a finishing pass with a smaller bit to refine the forms. The second one takes about 4 times as long as the first. And after carving those pieces, I assemble all of those layers and remove the tabs that held them in place. So you can kind of see these layers and then having to sort of glue or attach these other parts. One of the things about this shot that I want to emphasize is that these things don't just pop out of the machine. There's a level of engineering on the front end and significant amount of assembly, cleanup, and finishing on the other end. So when people think of although this is CNC routing, but even when people think of 3D printing, it's not just like you push a button and it's done all the time. There's still a lot more work often to be done. So I was able to work digitally and carve these volumes, and in that way it allowed me to reach the scale in those previous renderings. So this is basically the same size that you saw in that proposal. And this was my proof of concept for me to be able to work larger. So I'm going to kind of go off in a slightly different direction here for a second. This image looks something like out of a sci-fi movie, but it's just me working in VR. Here we go. Well, actually, didn't want to show that. Back and forth. So it's just me working in VR. I started using VR in 2017, not long after one VR system, which is called virtual reality system, which is called the Oculus Rift, became available. And the first time that I found out that you could actually draw and sculpt in digital space, like in VR, I was really sold on that idea, especially the first time I tried it on. And I made this video so that I could easily convey what it's like to work in VR. Let me turn down the sound a little bit here. What it's like to work in VR from the outside. It just looks like I'm shadow boxing while wearing the headset. But here I'm actually working in Oculus Medium, which is a sculpting app on the Oculus Rift, which is a VR system. And it's a totally immersive experience that allows you to walk around and modify the models as if you were in the same room. So I can push, pull, carve, paint, and add forms right there in virtual space. There's a virtual version of me in the app, so you can kind of see that's sort of representing me sculpting, which records where my head and hands are. And if I turn, it copies the same sort of movements. And they're just a few tools, and it's very intuitive to work with. It does take a little bit of getting used to the fact that there's no resistance because it's like you're sculpting in air, which makes them seem like makes it feel like you're carving on shaving cream. There's one more example of that. You can see I've actually, I'm working on a character. I can still sort of pushing, pulling, shaping these. And I'll skip ahead a little bit on this so you can kind of see a little bit further what the process is as I'm adding volume. And then painting those surfaces. So in this case, I was using it to sketch a character that I later used for sculpting. And actually, I showed my class this approach, and they were using it for the works in their for one of their assignments. So this led up to creating more involved works, and I collaborated in VR with one ceramics professor from USF. His name is John Bird. And this is a shot of us working in the VR environment together. And although he was at home and I was at home, nightly we were able to sort of independently sculpt in the same virtual space and pass the sculpture or tools back and forth. So, which was really, really kind of changes that studio experience as a whole, because actually I could also potentially be working with someone who's over in China or someone who's in Australia at the same time virtually. But still being able to look and see exactly what they're working on and kind of poke my head around their sculpture. So we explored adding bases and parts that were added to this form for this project that we were making. We started with a scan that we made, and then we started to carve away and reveal all other elements inside. We copied parts and repeated them. One breakthrough for us was when we started to actually sculpt things, and then we would subtract those from the sculpture. So basically here, it's almost like just adding, like taking one volume away from another or intersecting them. So this is more examples of doing that. I had all these sort of smaller elements inside, but I could subtract or create an intersection, which includes the shape of the overall sculpture. Another way that we approached this was to create sort of a library of shapes that we could use. So rather than thinking of it as a whole, sort of sculpting little bits and pieces and elements and then using them in the final works. So the person that we got to pose, we felt like the pose was a little bit suggestive in some ways. So we started working with the title Beefcake, which played on the relationship between meat and the body. And these are just other variations. So we in that same idea of sort of generating and culling, we created several versions to arrive at this final version, which we call Beefcake. After sculpting those, we wanted to be able to fabricate this. So I cut all of these into pieces and closed up the holes in my main sculpting application, which is called ZBrush. So I went from VR to ZBrush to finalize these, and we carved them out on the CNC router in foam. And we made what's called a contra mold here, which is a positive of the model. It's a mold, but it's a positive of the model rather than like a negative that you usually have for a mold. And really, it's kind of like the mold that comes, it's a mold for the mold. It comes before it. And to be able to get this plaster version of it. So here's what we made from that. And then we could use this for creating a press mold or a slip cast in which would be a ceramic piece. So press molds, basically, it's nothing complex about it. Basically, you just push the clay in to create. You push the clay in, and then you have a positive version of your model. For a slip cast, you actually put those pieces together and you pour in fluid clay, and then it hardens because the plaster sort of soaks up that moisture and it hardens around the edge. So you get this hollow version of it, and then you can pour the rest of it out so that you can fire it in the kiln. So in this case, the final work was in porcelain, and this is a shot of John finishing off the piece, at least in porcelain, and then creating a final, he actually added this, not charcoal, graphite surface to it. So I have this other, this is one of my most recent projects. And this is at the C. Blythe Andrews Library, which is in College Park. And for my initial proposal, well, actually, first of all, not long after I finished those pieces, I got this opportunity to propose and compete for this art project. And the request for the proposals was for a library in Tampa that is named and dedicated after C. Blythe Andrews. And Andrews was the founder of the Florida Sentinel, which is a biweekly newspaper founded in 1959. And it serves the Tampa Bay area African-American community. In my proposal called An Open Book, I feature two Black kids, male and female, which were either exposed to Black history or that their imaginations were kindled by the world which is revealed in this sort of open book. And I came up with about 3 variations of this, and the one on the left became the basis for my final design. Let me first say that when I was working on this, this was 2 or 3 weeks before my wife went into labor. And I had about a week to come up with and submit my proposal while I was also teaching classes. So that was a challenging, I would say challenging year, but challenging time. So I had never done a sculptural public art project and hadn't created something at this scale. So, and I was up against seasoned sculptors that had much more experience. But one advantage that I did have was that I could pre-visualize it digitally within a fairly short time. So once I had the design, I started making very simple mannequins, and I began to pose them in a way similar to the sketch. And working in ZBrush, I used my then 7-year-old son as a model and gathered images from multiple views. For the other, I referenced multiple images that I gathered online. And an important aspect to me was to make sure that they were readable as being Black, and that the hair, and the hair was also an important part for that. And I created this hairstyle for the girl, but as you'll see, I went in a different direction later. So this is one of the final images that I submitted for the proposal. Both kids were seated on the bench. A globe is emerging from the book, and a rocket ship circles around it. And a butterfly sort of rests on her shoulder. I wanted more elements, but I simplified it based on the time and for clarity. But as you can see, time and for clarity. And then I got into the final sculpting. So here, you can see some of the rough sculpting. Some things I was able to get rough scans for. So this is a really rough scan, but you can see that the front of the hand has no surface detail. It has no information there. I've kind of pieced together other parts in here to work with. And then I went into to sculpt these more to refine those shapes. And you can see how the hand sort of evolves from this process of sculpting manually. This is just one part of the whole, and actually this is even a bit of a step back, but I rendered out this version of the model for a milestone approval for the project. So, and rather than, because I was working completely virtually, often you would show like, well, this is the physical object that I'm making for any other sculptor. But in this way, I was able to actually go in and light it so that I could say, well, this is what it's looking like at this stage, which is still sort of virtual. And these are a few other views. So I'm going to skip ahead here. This is, well, almost there, but you can see this is actually me going back in and revising the hair, looking at other ways to kind of address that. And I've decided to go with more traditional braids for those. Now, this is the final bronze sculpture before installation. And I have a short video that shows that full process. And I'll turn down the sound so I can talk a little bit over it while going through that. So you can see it from start to end and how all of these parts, even from the beginning, the earlier stages of learning to work with digital sculpting, kind of work with how I approach this project. So this is the final installation at the library. You can kind of see the sculpture in the round here, the map, the globe, and details. So here I'm sculpting in ZBrush as in the beginning, working on this antique. Working to develop the face and sort of trying to get a good sense of sort of likeness and detail. I won't play the whole thing, but it allowed me to use a lot of techniques that come from, traditional sculpture, but also come from ways that one might work if working on a game. So, and kind of really applying that technology. So here I'm masking out parts and kind of really refining the hair. One unique thing I think that I was able to do with this was the way that I approached creating the clothing for it. So, and it's interesting how all of these things relate, because the way that I created the clothing, which will come up in a second, was the way that you would create a pattern for that you would traditionally sew. It was created completely two-dimensionally, and as a flat pattern. And then I was able to actually drape that on the figure. You'll see it in a second, but here's just more sculpting on the hand, that kind of thing. So here you can kind of see the 2D pattern, just like you might find in McCall's or something like that. And then on the left-hand side, there's the actual figure where it's draped and it's actually able to be dynamically moved. So a very different way of sort of sculpting that. Then, and sort of the final sculpt from that. The rest are a whole bunch of steps to be able to get it out of the computer. Remember, I was saying that the CNC router carves straight down, so I'd have to separate it into pieces, little thin sheets, and lay them out, and tell the machine this is how it should carve these, like decide how it carves around it, and what it should start with first, what type of cut it should use, what size bit. So this is the CNC router aspect of it. And what I was left with was all of these sheets that that I could take that I would eventually have to kind of take the sections out of it. So you can kind of see I have this part. These are the individual sheets, and I would go and take them out one part at a time. So it was like a big 3D puzzle to put all these pieces together. I ended up pinning them together and then actually drilling them. Mainly because I needed some way to clamp them together, and the glue that I was using, it would actually push the pieces apart. So I had to make sure that those were clamped pretty well. But this is a very firm foam. It's kind of like working with a soft wood. So you can see even like how I'm carving here on it, which makes that more, so you can just carve it like wood, which I actually really enjoy. So this is almost like that intermediate step before that I was saying with being able to kind of work back into the wax versions of them. And so I have this sort of original foam version, and then the next part is really getting the wax. There we have the wax from that. So making the molds, you can see that it's been cast in bronze at this point. And this is installation day. So just to kind of, which was a really exciting thing to actually be able to put in the final piece. So the final piece is probably about, they have it on, this is probably about 400 pounds in terms of the bronze. And again, I've tended to use this sort of graphite surface. So it has sort of a metallic kind of feel to it, but then the bronze also shows through as well. And it's just a final shot of that sculpture. So that's the last slide that I have here. So thank you. And I guess I want to open it up to see if there are any questions.
Yes, there are. And thank you so much, McArthur. Let me just open up the chat box here and I'll pose the questions that have been put on chat. So let me get back to the first one, I think. Well, one of them was probably my question. Wait, here's a Nathan. On your early plastic covered wax 3D prints, do you anticipate the plastic or resin to change color over time? That was a question from Nathan.
I do think it's possible that it can change over time. Now, I don't, those pieces though, I still have them. I don't show them as final pieces, and they're kind of like, I kind of see them as prototypes. So those are cast in, I've recast those in resin, which I don't expect to change over time at all.
Okay.
So
another question followed by the phrase, this is amazing. So will sculptors in the future even need a physical studio? To be clear, he's referring to the virtual reality environment that you were using. So do you think there'll be actual studios in the future or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think that definitely physical sculpture will continue to be around. I don't expect that to go away at all. Drawing hasn't gone away, painting hasn't gone away in that sense. But there's still, but I think it's another avenue for creation. I think what I'm excited about seeing is actually when, I think it opens the door for having maybe virtual exhibitions or like in terms of VR spaces, we might actually visit and be able to walk around those spaces in VR as well and see pieces. It's another way of showing it, but I don't think it'll get rid of physical sculpture.
Additional, okay. And I had a question. What is the digital sculpting software program? You mentioned something about ZBrush. I don't know if that's
Yeah, so I use a few. The main program that I use is called ZBrush, and that's the one that actually uses a tablet. So for instance, even this is my pen that I sculpt with, basically. But there are several others that are similar to it. And then, like I said, there's the VR Sculpt, which is the VR software, which is called Medium. There's even there are even two apps on the iPad that allow you to sculpt very, very similar to working in ZBrush. One is called Forger, and I can't remember the name of the other one right now, but mainly I use I mainly use ZBrush, and then I guess next to that Medium, and then I do sculpt on the iPad a little bit.
Okay. Let's see. So another question here is, what is the conversation like in sculptors' circles about the future of the physical object? Will we as viewers one day experience your kind of work only virtually? You kind of mentioned that just now about virtual tours and exhibits, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do expect to see a lot more of it. I don't know how broad that will be, or how quickly that will be adopted. I mean, I think there have been some virtual VR sort of exhibitions, like with works, but they're not. It's definitely not common yet. So I definitely think that we will see more artwork that is in that space. I don't know like who will adopt it, if it's the same people who would actually be interested in traditional sculpture. My background isn't coming from traditional sculpture, so and oftentimes I talk to other sculptors and I've presented at conferences but my approach has been sort of really back from the other end. It's like I found sculpture through working in the computer, rather than whereas many of them, and there are a lot of sculptors who are excited about it, who have been working with very physical materials, and then they're trying to kind of get a grasp on the computer. I'm kind of going the other way. I'm kind of trying to get a grasp on the physical materials in some ways. Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple more questions on here. This is from Diane Cox-Weiss. Amazing presentation. How many hours did it take to complete the project for the library? How would that compare to traditional sculpting?
You know, it's hard to, I don't know the hours. I worked on it for about a year, but during that year, that was kind of broken up. I was teaching. Like I said, I had a newborn daughter. So and it was over, and a lot of that time is not just, I mean, a lot of that is also contracts and ordering benches and getting engineers and kinds of all other things that are involved. But I think especially for this first time, I think it was very, my assumption is that it's very comparable to what it would be like to do it traditionally in terms of the time. However, doing it again, I don't think would be like that, because a lot of it had to do with figuring out how to put things together and how to carve them and how to break it down. So, and in being able to have the finished sculpt came much quicker. It was really that translation to physical form again, which the thing that took a lot more time to figure out.
Okay, we have a couple more comments here. This one's from Catherine Bergman, our curator at DFAC. Her comment, McArthur, your skills plus creations are absolutely mind-blowing. Have you ever been approached by the film or entertainment industry?
I have not been approached by the film or entertainment industry. I think when I first started, because I've done digital illustrations as well, and I had that drawing and painting background, I have done some work for games for like concept art and that type of thing, which is really related. And I'm continuously looking at work like that and work that comes from that field, or interacting with people from that field as well. But I have not pushed in that direction, and I haven't been contacted by someone like that. There are a lot of, so these are a lot of these tools, at least the like ZBrush, these are the tools that are very common to that area. So what's not as common is actually maybe bringing it into working to bring these works into sort of the physical realm.
Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and tell the audience still on to go ahead and unmute yourself in order to raise a question. It looks like James, who I don't see on the screen, had his hand raised. So maybe he has his video off. But anybody that still has some more questions, feel free to turn on your video part so your face pops up and unmute yourself. In the meantime, it looks like Nathan has asked a question. As an educator, what kind of technological outlook are your students bringing to the table? Do they prefer one material or process over another? Example, more traditional versus digital / virtual?
Well, I think first the most of the students that I work with are animation students. So they are interested, they're usually interested in creating the artwork and assets for film and games, and animating those. So they already are it's already sort of narrowed down in that sense. And I'm not sure how specific his question was, but I do find that there's in terms of, like I talked about not traditional, but digital modeling, which is maybe a more traditional way of making things versus sculpting. Digital sculpting, and there's a pretty, a lot of them like to actually do the digital sculpting, but there's a good split between them. In VR, I've kind of introduced that we don't spend as much time there working in VR, but I think the thing is just the sort of there's an overall amazement with it, and fascination with it. And I think as we go along, we'll see that as being used more and more as a tool to create and visualize, and actually animate. You can animate in VR, which is actually another thing. But it's new space.
Okay, and
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm Marlis from St. Petersburg, and I wondered whether he was inspired at all by Q Yamamoto's sculpture at the fire station on 4th Street North in St. Petersburg. The little boy and the little girl sitting on the bench. Was that an inspiration?
No, I'm not familiar with that sculpture.
Come see it. Yours is gorgeous. Thank you so much for sharing. I think you'll enjoy seeing this in St. Petersburg.
Great, I will. Thank you.
You're welcome.
They also reminded me of some of the sculptures in Birmingham, in the park across from the church, and museum from the march. Just the powerful sort of appearance of them. I loved them. And it looks like James Smith still has his hand raised, but I don't see him. His mic is.
I think I'm on it. Am I not?
There you are. Go for it.
I have many questions. McArthur, I'm a bronze sculptor and in Clearwater. So I really with my dog Tag here. At any rate, I have a lot of questions. You're before you get to the finished bronze, you mentioned your sculpture was solid bronze.
It was almost solid bronze for that smaller, for one like pineapple, which is the
But
inner
not
small.
The larger piece that you did for
no.
So you had to make a mold of something. Was that a fiber? Something other? You use silicone or urethane rubber mold for those?
Yes, it's a silicone mold from the so basically I have the foam original or foam sort of initial one, and then there's a silicone, and then there's a mother mold for that as well, for parts of that. Yeah.
Right. So that process is the standard way to do a bronze sculpture. So
exactly.
What is the cost involvement to do the taking notes here? I'd like to meet with you personally, by the way, to go through a lot of these things. If we ever have a chance to get over to Clearwater, we're setting up a foundry here, as a matter of fact, as well.
Oh, great, awesome.
But I've been doing this stuff for, I guess, 26 years. I've been sculpting. so you're, I guess my major questions are, what would be the cost to get involved in the CNC router? I'm not sure I'll do that. But the VR stuff though sounds interesting. What's the cost of that equipment to?
The VR, so it may have, mine was one of like the sort of first generation of those that came out. There may be a slight difference in the pricing now, but it's going to be similar. The VR headset and controllers, because the hand controllers are about $300. They're not that bad at all.
Wow. Yeah. No.
Yeah, did I say that right? Yeah, I think they're about 300. I'm gonna guess it's like 300 to 350 now. But the bigger investment is the computer, because you have to have a computer that can run that they can run the VR software. And so I mean, I think that's the bigger thing. So I had to get a computer just for that. They do have VR headsets that don't need to be attached to a computer. Unfortunately, the sculpting app that I was sculpting in doesn't work with those unless you plug it into a computer.
Wow.
So really it's the cost of the computer, which is, I mean, that can range, you know, I don't know, $2,000 or something like that for the computer. That is maybe a starting point. And then but the VR headset is maybe like 300, 350, somewhere in that range.
Not that costly, actually. Okay. Yeah, I'd like to get together with you sometime. How would I reach you?
Well, you can actually send me an email. We can get in contact that way. My website is one way to email me, and I can kind of get back to you from there. And my website is just I think it'll be posted with.
Right, there'll be information on the DFAC website about how to contact him. So yeah, you'll have plenty of opportunity for lots of questions and exchange.
I look forward to it. I don't want to take a lot of time here, but I a lot of an infinite amount of questions. It's amazing. Super presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, that many of the things on the chat, and I will provide these to you also, McArthur, the printout of the chat. There's a couple of lots of applause on there. Somebody asked they'd like to learn more about Nasty Jemima. I'm not sure exactly what they want to learn, but somebody out there. And actually, I think that was from Catherine, who I think had to sign off, but she's thanking you for an amazing presentation and lots of clapping on the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Tell us more about Nasty Jemima.
Okay. So basically, in that image, I was using several images that come from stereotypical images that kind of face off of blackface and minstrelsy. Nasty Jemima is one image that kind of is sort of descendant of the sort of mammy image as well. And that was in that piece. I think in the painting that I created, she, I think even just as a mammy, I think one of the things that I did is she has, I think, she has 6 arms, this multitasking. And I think there's sort of a dehumanization in terms of actually trying to manage these things for everyone else, kind of helping. She also has 2 sets of breasts in the image. But really I was kind of playing off the idea that these images, like for instance in Aunt Jemima Pancake, they're still sort of even though the images have been cleaned up and kind of like some of the history of it has been masked, it's still there. So, and that's part of what I was kind of doing with that image and that character.
Another question somewhat related. This is from Nathan, and several other people in the audience are interested. It says, your process is fascinating. Can we switch gears from process to concept and talk a little about the monsterization of the Black body? Maybe some of us here are not familiar with that. And if you outline it, we might be more sensitive to it when we're in the public sphere.
Right. So I mentioned monsterization and exoticization of the Black body. And I think that, well, there are a lot of ways to kind of talk about this, but when I originally made those works, I was talking about like how it was about like masks or things being added on to be able to adapt to social situations. one way of thinking about it is like code switching, to sort of perform another identity, but that may be something where someone is trying to hide their Blackness or hide things that might be seen as Blackness. In other cases, it might be exaggerating ideas about Blackness, maybe even as a protective aspect. Maybe it is about being defensive in a way, but it's not necessarily the natural disposition or personality or persona of that person. But over time, by wearing that mask and sort of performing those identities in order to adapt, what happens is that that transforms the person. So an undercurrent. So in my work, in those works, a large part of it was about how modifying oneself, modifying one's actions and appearance and personality has an effect on who you are. It actually changes or it distorts who you are. So those works are all sort of distortions of the body, in some ways, distortions of the identity, I guess, with those sculptures. Exoticization is a similar thing. I mean, even the idea that these are like specimens that are shown. I mean, it's if I think of there's one. If I think of Sarah Bartman, this African woman who was shown often because of the size of her buttocks, right? But the thing is, then it was exaggerated so much so that it becomes it becomes not just a stereotype, but this distortion of what she is. Almost they made it larger even, and so much to where they started doing science. When after she died, they did all of these. They sort of preserved her genitals and did all these tests. And I think the idea that even Black bodies could be sort of experimented on in this way, or that young kids are often looked at as adults. And people may look at them and say, oh, well, I'm scared of this person. Even police officers looking at someone who's Black and saying, oh, well, I thought he was older or an adult, and then tried in that way. And so I think it's really about, so when I'm talking about beauty on one hand. I'm talking about the idea of Black people often being represented as being not human, or being seen as older. That's something that's happened throughout history in many ways, right? But that still continues now. I mean, in terms of the question, I mean, I could have specific things like they have to do it now, but it wasn't just about now. It's about like, it's about like how that's happened in many ways over time. Did I answer that question well enough? Or maybe not?
For my purposes, you did. I think the
Okay.
question was posed by Nathan. I'm not sure if he's still on. Well, it looks like an answer, yes. Yeah, I was curious if it was recently came to light in your works because of what's going on so much in the media these days, and the huge concerns about Black lives, but it has been going on historically forever. So.
Yeah, and I think even with what we see in the media currently, it's I think the reason that it has been brought to the forefront is because these things have been happening for so long, and then it's kind of like, I think at this point, it's at a point where I think people really feel like something needs to be done. We've seen it over and over again, but now we need to actually really address these things. So even when I was making those works then, it was still about similar things, and I think it resonates with what's going on now. I think they're the same issues. It's not that they're different issues; they're the same issues. Mm-hmm. And those are in my earliest works. I was making works about police brutality, so that actually came before any of the ones that I showed. So those are not new issues. It's just a matter of they've kind of come to a head.
There's a couple of questions around the same topic from Susan Williamson. She wants to know if you'll continue to make those types of works. And she asked earlier, she says, McArthur, I love your public book sculpture, but also the morphed body parts. Are you still making morphed figures?
I am still, well, I have been making more figures right now. I am, well, first of all, I plan to continue to make works about Blackness and the construction of identity. I think that's a clear thing. I think the works like the Public Art Project kind of moves in a different direction in the sense of the clarity of the sort of figurative aspects of it, but also I think in terms of it doesn't it does not have the same type of critique that the other works have. But I think it's an important aspect because it's important that we have images of Black people that are represented living their lives in multiple ways. And I think that's something that's sort of missing and missing sometimes. So I think it's different, but I do intend to, and so I'm looking forward to making both types of works when I get the opportunity. But I think my primary work will continue to be about making work that's about the Blackness, exploring Blackness, and how identity is constructed or transformed or distorted. And my next steps right now, I'm on sabbatical this year, so I'm kind of taking things in. So I'm in a holding pattern in some ways, kind of figuring out what my next step is. I would like to, I think really I'm interested in creating these worlds back in sort of in a virtual space as well. So I think that's probably the bigger, I think that's the direction that I'm moving in. And also those decolonization dolls, which I never made. So.
Thank you so much, McArthur. I've been looking at the chat, and I think there's a comment here. I think we are very lucky to have you here in Tampa. That's from Nathan. And there's still, I don't know, 16 or so people on staying on, but it's about that time we wrap up. So unless somebody else has more questions, we just all want to do applause for you and thank you so much. And good luck with your sabbatical.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. And anybody who's still on, please come to the Art Center to see up close and personal his work. So goodbye to all of you and see you next month. Look for the next month Coffee and Conversation announcement.